Hey, this is Holly from Pocket-Sized Tales. Today I will be narrating this episode's story. Our host Logan put a lot of work into writing and editing this, so if you enjoy it, please like, subscribe, comment, and share this and other stories from Pocket-Sized Tales. It goes a long way to supporting this channel. And if you're extra genres, please make a purchase from the Pocket Shop. The link is in the description. Anyway, without further ado, let's get on with the story. Thanks everyone. The Haunting at Wentworth Manor. Chapter 1, The New Governess. Sarah stepped out of the carriage and looked up at the imposing manor. It was a grand old house, with tall windows, turrets, and a wrought iron gate that creaked in the wind. But there was something about it that sent a shiver down her spine, a feeling of foreboding that she couldn't quite explain. She had been hired as a governess for the children of the wealthy family living there. William and Abigail, a boy and a girl aged 10 and 8 respectively, would be her charges. Sarah had been excited to take on the job, but as she approached the manor, her excitement was replaced by an uneasy feeling. A middle-aged woman opened the door and greeted her with a warm smile. "You must be Miss Sarah," she said. "I'm Mrs. Jacobs, the housekeeper. Please come in." Sarah stepped into the grand hallway, which was dimly lit by flickering candles. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-looking ancestors, and the air was heavy with the scent of old wood and musty carpets. As you already know, Master and Lady Wentworth are overseas conducting business. "But let me take you to meet the children," Mrs. Jacobs said, leading Sarah up a sweeping staircase and down a long hallway. As they walked, Sarah couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. She kept turning around, but there was no one there. She shook her head and chided herself for being so paranoid. At the end of the hallway, they came to a pair of tall oak doors. Mrs. Jacobs knocked 3 times and then opened the door. "William, Abigail, this is Miss Sarah, your new governess," she said. The children were sitting at a small table, bent over their books. William looked up first, his brown eyes studying Sarah carefully. Abigail followed suit, her blue eyes bright with curiosity. "Hello, it is a pleasure to meet both of you," Sarah said, smiling at them. "Hello," William said, his voice serious. Abigail giggled and said, "Hello, Miss Sarah. You have pretty hair." "Thank you," the governess laughed. "You can just call me Sarah." She sat down at the table and introduced herself properly. The children were polite but reserved, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if they were as wary of her as she was of them. After a few more pleasantries, Mrs. Jacobs took Sarah to her room, which was located in a wing of the manor that had once been used for guests. It was a comfortable room, with a 4-poster bed, a fireplace, and a window that looked out over the gardens. As Sarah unpacked her belongings, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the manor. It was as if there was a weight pressing down on her, a presence that she couldn't quite put her finger on. She tried to shake off her unease and focus on her new job. She would be responsible for the education and care of William and Abigail, and she wanted to do her best for them. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what surprises awaited her in the new role. Chapter 2, The First Haunting. Sarah began noticing strange occurrences around the manor, such as objects moving on their own and unexplained noises. William and Abigail start experiencing frightening events as well, such as seeing the ghostly figure of a woman. Sarah tried to reassure the children and maintain a sense of normalcy, but she is increasingly uneasy. The manor was alive with strange occurrences. It started small. A vase that had been on the mantel was now on the floor, shattered into 1,000 pieces. Sarah thought nothing of it at first, chalking it up to a gust of wind or one of the children playing too roughly. But then other things started happening. A chair in the library was moved from its usual spot, as if someone had sat there and then gotten up. Doors opened and closed on their own, and footsteps echoed through the halls when no one was there. Sarah tried to ignore it, tried to believe that there was a logical explanation for everything. But as the days went on, the occurrences became more frequent and more disturbing. Objects would move from one place to another, as if an invisible force was playing a game of hide and seek. The children became increasingly frightened, especially when they saw the dark shadowy figure of what looked like a lady. Sarah did her best to reassure them, to maintain a sense of normalcy. But she was starting to feel uneasy. There was something malevolent in the air, something that whispered in her ear when she was alone. She tried to shake it off, to tell herself that it was just her imagination, but the feeling persisted. One night, as she was putting the children to bed, they heard a loud crash from downstairs. Sarah tried to stay calm, but her heart was pounding in her chest. She hurried out to the hallway with the children following closely behind her. She stopped at the top of the staircase at the end of the hall. From above they could see a small statue lying in pieces at the foot of the staircase. "What was that?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Stay here. I'm going to find out." "I want to go too," William objected. "No. Stay here. It'll be much safer," Sarah said, matching her stern tone with a serious face. "Please look after your sister." She made her way down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway was dark and silent, and Sarah's nerves were stretched to their breaking point. As she approached the living room, she could see that the front entry door was wide open, and a cold breeze was blowing through the room. She took a deep breath and tiptoed over there. Sarah glanced outside, but no one was there. After closing the door and locking it, she turned her attention to the living room. It was empty, but there was a feeling of dread that hung in the air like a thick fog. Sarah ignored it and focused on finding the source of the noise. And then she saw it. A shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, dressed in a gown, her hair piled high on her head. Sarah could feel her heart racing in her chest, her breath coming in short gasps. The figure turned and looked at her, and Sarah could see the fear and anger in her eyes. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and no words would come out. The figure turned and vanished into the wall, as if it had never been there at all. Sarah stood there, frozen in fear. Something tugged at her sleeve from behind, and she almost leapt out of her skin. The governess whipped around to see the boy and his younger sister. "Is everything all right? Did you see who it is?" William asked. Sarah shook her head, her voice catching in her throat as she tried to compose herself. She hoped the children hadn't noticed how scared she was. What are you two doing here?" "I thought I told you to stay put," Sarah demanded. "We waited and waited, but you never came back, so we got worried," Abigail said. "Come on then." Sarah started toward the stairs, guiding the pair along. "Let's get you two back to bed. I'll have Mrs. Jacobs clean this in the morning." As they made their way back up the stairs, she knew that something was terribly wrong in the manor. Chapter 3, Investigating Lady Agatha. The strange occurrences continued, and the ghostly figure of a lady appeared to them more frequently, as if she was trying to communicate something. Sarah knew she needed to understand the history of the house, to find the cause of the phenomenon. She spent hours in the library, poring over old books and documents. She discovered a woman named Lady Agatha had been the mistress of the manor almost a century ago, a woman known for her beauty and her sharp tongue. Determined to learn more, Sarah questioned Mrs. Jacobs and the rest of the staff. They referred her to Mr. Evans, the town's historian, and with that she set out to speak with him. She found him at the local library, surrounded by stacks of books. "Excuse me, Mr. Evans?" Sarah approached the elderly man and introduced herself. "Miss Sarah, how can I assist you?" Mr. Evans looked up from his book, adjusting his spectacles. "I was hoping you could tell me more about Lady Agatha, the former mistress of Wentworth Manor. I've heard rumors that her spirit haunts the place." Sarah couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine as she spoke the words. Mr. Evans let out a deep sigh. Ah, Lady Agatha. A tragic tale, that one. Her husband, Declan Griffith, was a successful businessman who owned a factory in town. After they were married, he fell ill and passed away shortly after. The townsfolk were devastated, as Mr. Griffith was a beloved figure in the community. So what happened to Lady Agatha? Sarah pressed. Well, after her husband's death, she became the sole inheritor of his wealth and became known for her lavish parties and extravagant lifestyle. Rumors soon swirled about her involvement in her husband's demise and was accused of foul play by some members of the town. It caused quite a scandal, as you can imagine. She was eventually acquitted of any crime. A few years afterwards she died under mysterious circumstances. The official story was that she took her own life as a result of being distraught over her husband's death. Others whispered she had been murdered by a jealous lover, Mr. Evans said. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as she processed the information. The tragic story of Lady Agatha was enough to send shivers down her spine. She thanked Mr. Evans for his time and made her way back to the manor. The weight of the tragic history of the house was almost palpable. Sarah couldn't ignore the feeling that Lady Agatha's ghost was behind the strange occurrences that she experienced. She knew she had to find a way to lay her spirit to rest before it was too late. Chapter 4, More Secrets Revealed. As Sarah sat at her desk, trying to go about her usual duties as the governess of the Wentworth children, her mind was consumed by the disturbing dreams that had been plaguing her lately. She had been having disturbing nightmares of Lady Agatha and her abusive husband, Mr. Griffith. In the visions she was physically and emotionally abused. Her husband often belittled and chastised her behind closed doors, accusing her of infidelity. She hid her scars and never told a single soul about her pain and suffering. Mr. Griffith occasionally had affairs with other women. No one knew except those he was with. Despite what the man put his wife through, he played the perfect husband in public. Doing and saying all the right things at the right time like a slimy politician. The dreams were so vivid Sarah felt like she was reliving the events alongside Lady Agatha. As Sarah sat in the parlor, her mind wandering, she felt a sudden urge to explore the manor. She had been avoiding the attic for some time, as she felt an uneasy presence there, but that day she felt a pull towards it. She made her way up the winding staircase to the attic, her heart drumming against her rib cage. As she pushed open the creaky door, Sarah was met with a wave of dust and musty air. She coughed and squinted her eyes, trying to adjust to the dim light. As her eyes adjusted, Sarah saw a chest sitting in the corner of the room. She made her way over to it, her curiosity piqued. As she opened the chest, Sarah was surprised to find a stack of old diaries. She picked one up and started to flip through the pages. It was Lady Agatha's diary. The entries were heart-wrenching, detailing the abuse and pain she suffered at the hands of Mr. Griffith. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she read the diary. At the back of the book, Sarah noticed an envelope tucked into the back cover. She pulled it out and saw it was addressed to a secret lover. Sarah's heart raced as she realized that this was the missing piece of Lady Agatha's story. She carefully opened the envelope and pulled out the letters. The letters were full of declarations of love and passion, as well as details of secret trysts and stolen moments. Sarah felt like she was intruding on something deeply personal and intimate, but she couldn't stop reading. As she read the final letter, she felt a chill run down her spine. It was clear from the words on the page that Lady Agatha's lover was someone she could never be with. The letter ended abruptly, leaving Sarah with a sense of unease. As Sarah made her way back down to her room, she couldn't shake the feeling she had uncovered something dangerous. The more she learned about Lady Agatha's past, the more she was putting herself and the Wentworth children in danger. Chapter 5, Frightening Encounter. That night after Sarah finished putting the children to bed and was making her way to her room, she was alerted by a distant whisper. Curious, she followed it all the way down the stairs to the grand hallway. It was lit only by the dim flicker of a few candles. She walked slowly, taking each step with caution, feeling as though something or someone was eyeing her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she couldn't shake the feeling of a cold breath on her neck. As she turned the corner, she froze in place. There was a woman with a dark tangled mess of hair draped in a tattered gown standing no more than 10 feet away with her back to Sarah. Something was awfully wrong with the woman, and Sarah could feel it. Her breath shuttered and she struggled to swallow the huge knot forming in her throat. The stranger stiffly turned to meet Sarah's gaze. It was none other than Lady Agatha, or what used to be her. The thing glared at Sarah with the whites of its cold, dead eyes. Its mouth twisted and agaped, moving ever so slightly as if muttering something. Its head hung loosely off its shoulder from its bent and crooked neck. The gal's arms dangled by its side and swayed as it approached the governess. Sarah tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't move. The thing disappeared, then reappeared with every other step. It got closer and closer until it was right in front of her, just inches from her face. Sarah wanted to scream, to run away, but she couldn't. She was paralyzed with fear. Lady Agatha's ghost started to speak, her voice raspy and choked. "I've been waiting for you, Sarah," Lady Agatha said, her eyes boring into Sarah's soul. Sarah tried to speak, but no words came out. She just stared into Lady Agatha's milky white eyes, trying to understand what she wanted. "You have something I want," Lady Agatha continued, her voice growing louder and more insistent. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't think. She didn't know what Lady Agatha was talking about, nor did she know how to make her go away. Suddenly, the candles in the hallway flickered and went out, plunging everything in total darkness. Sarah felt Lady Agatha's cold, dead hands on her face, and she let out a blood-curdling scream echoing throughout the house. Sarah kicked, rolled, and screamed until she felt something hard strike the side of her head with a loud thud and lost consciousness. The next morning Sarah woke up on her bed with a major headache. She didn't know how she got there, but was relieved she was still alive. The governess didn't know how to feel about the previous night. Had it just been a terrible nightmare? She wished more than anything for it to be a nightmare because it felt so real. She gingerly felt around the sore spot on her head and grimaced, realizing it had been bandaged. The door opened and Mrs. Jacobs walked in with a steamy tray of breakfast, greeting her with a smile. Sarah could smell the sweet and savory scent of cooked eggs, meat and pancakes. Her stomach growled at the smell of breakfast as she sat up with her back against the wall. "I do hope you're feeling much better, Miss Sarah," the housekeeper said, setting the tray in front of her. "My head hurts." "What happened?" Sarah asked. "I'm not quite sure, but it looked like you had an accident getting out of bed this morning. When you didn't show up for breakfast, the children got concerned, so I came to check on you. I found you on the floor along with the pillows and blankets," said Mrs. Jacobs. Sarah had begun to eat her food. But as she chewed, she couldn't stop thinking about Lady Agatha. The intensely frightening visions in her mind combined with her icy touch made Sarah tremble with fear. Mrs. Jacobs stood beside the bed for a moment waiting on a response, but none came. Just as she was about to leave, Sarah finally spoke. "Mrs. Jacobs, there's something very wrong with this house." "I beg your pardon," the housekeeper exclaimed. "Pretending nothing is wrong won't make the problem go away," Sarah shot back. "The accidents. Things moving on their own. Doors opening and closing by themselves. Then there is Lady Agatha. It's all too much for it to be a coincidence. Don't you think so? I will not have you disrespect the Wentworth home in such a manner. If it's all too much for you, then perhaps you'd best discuss your resignation with Mr. and Mrs. Wentworth when they get back. I'm appalled at your behavior, Miss Sarah. Now if you'll excuse me. I've more pressing matters to attend to," shouted the housekeeper, stomping out of the room. The children. It isn't safe for the children, Sarah pleaded, her voice deflating in defeat upon deaf ears. As the nights passed, Sarah was beginning to feel like she was losing her mind. The ghostly presence of Lady Agatha seemed to be closing in on her, suffocating her with its intensity. She couldn't escape it, no matter where she went in the manor. It was always there, lurking in the shadows, watching her with its ghostly eyes. The children were also struggling to cope with the haunting. Both William and Abigail suffered constantly from night terrors and had become withdrawn. Sarah didn't know what to do to help them. She felt like they were all trapped in a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. Sarah knew that something needed to be done, but she didn't know what. She couldn't fight Lady Agatha's ghost on her own, and none of the staff were willing to listen or help. She needed to find someone who knew how to deal with ghosts, and fast. Chapter 6, Seeking Help. Sarah had never been a religious person, but desperation drove her to seek out the help of the local clergyman. She had tried everything to rid the manor of Lady Agatha's ghost, but nothing had worked. The ghostly apparitions and unexplained noises had become more frequent, and the children were becoming more and more frightened. As Sarah approached the small, stone church, she couldn't help but feel apprehensive. The building had an eerie, abandoned feel to it, as if no one had entered its doors in years. She pushed the heavy wooden doors open and was greeted by the sound of creaking pews and the musty smell of old hymnals. The clergyman, Reverend Thompson, was a bright and cheerful person. He was younger than what Sarah expected for someone in such a position. He listened intently as Sarah recounted her experiences with Lady Agatha's ghost and the haunting of the manor. He nodded thoughtfully, his expression growing more concerned with each passing moment. "I'm afraid I'm not experienced in exorcisms," he said regretfully, "but I am willing to help in any way that I can." Sarah's heart sank at the realization that the only person she could turn to for help was ill-equipped to deal with the situation. But she knew that she had no other choice. "Please, Reverend," she implored, "we need your help. I don't know what else to do." The clergyman sighed and nodded, "I will do my best, Miss Sarah. But I must warn you that this will not be an easy task. Exorcisms are dangerous, and there is no guarantee of success." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine at the thought of the risks involved, but she knew that she had to do everything in her power to protect the children and rid the manor of the ghostly presence that had taken hold of it. "Thank you, Reverend," she said softly. "We appreciate your help more than you know." As she left the church, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in her chest. She knew that they were in for a long and difficult battle, but she was determined to see it through to the end. The safety of the children and the peace of the manor depended on it. Chapter 7, The Exorcism. Reverend Thompson was making some last-minute preparations for the exorcism. Though he had never done one, he had come across various cases involving them during his studies, since testing was part of the process of becoming a clergyman. He was meticulous and reviewed as many cases related to the procedure as he could find, making note of every detail. He even thought about consulting with the former priest, Caspar Blake. If anyone knew how to deal with ghosts and demons, it was him. He was considered a legend in that field. Several articles Reverend Thompson dug up were cases Blake directly oversaw. Some of the stories were quite disturbing. There was one about a young girl who murdered and ate her entire family. She then proceeded to terrorize the town she lived in. Blake eventually apprehended her and exorcised the demon. When she came to, she had no recollection of what happened. Demonology and ghost studies wasn't a field the Reverend felt comfortable in. He also had his doubts if any of it were real at all, considering he'd never had any experiences with the supernatural. He supposed anything was possible. Despite being a renowned exorcist, Caspar Blake wasn't fit to be a priest. Though Thieve never officially met Reverend Thompson, had seen him around town, but never without a bottle of alcohol. Though Caspar was much older than him and was his senior, He was everything the Reverend aspired not to be, especially for being a man of the cloth. The former priest had a reputation for being brash and displaying lewd behavior toward women. The man was a disgrace, what help can he be? Thought the Reverend. Unfortunately, time was short and there was only so much preparation he could do before heading out, so early that evening he arrived at the manor. Reverend Thompson had a large wooden crucifix in hand and a Bible under his arm. He had a serious and determined look on his face, but also a hint of fear in his eyes. Sarah greeted him at the door and led him to the living room where the rest of the household was waiting, or rather what was left of them. Most of the staff had already left. Sarah had her suspicions as to why. If not for the children, she would have been gone as well. She even tried to convince Mrs. Jacobs the children would be much safer away from the house, but the old housekeeper would have none of it. Now she could only hope the clergyman would be able to get rid of Lady Agatha's ghost. Reverend Thompson instructed everyone to join hands and follow his lead in reciting passages from the Bible. After that was done, the Reverend then started chanting the Lord's Prayer while walking through the house, holding the cross in front of him as he sprinkled holy water wherever he went. Without realizing it, he was squeezing the crucifix so tight his hand started to shake. Had he squeezed it any harder, the cross would have snapped in two. Anxiety began to stew in his mind and doubt started to creep in, the deeper he got into the house. The clergyman's unshakable faith didn't seem so unshakable after all. Nonetheless, he pushed onwards. As he reached the attic, the temperature in the room dropped drastically, and the air became thick with an eerie presence. Suddenly, Reverend Thompson felt a cold breeze that chilled him to the bone. He tried to continue with the exorcism, but Lady Agatha's spirit was too powerful. She manifested herself in front of him. The Reverend became paralyzed with fear and immediately bolted downstairs, heading straight for the door. As he did, Lady Agatha's ghost exploded with a demonic laughter that shook the entire house. A gust of wind blew through the halls of the manor, causing all the candles within it to dance wildly. Everyone looked on frantically as if the house was going to collapse on them. Reverend Thompson came down the stairs so fast he missed the last couple steps and stumbled onto the floor. Everyone downstairs rushed over to see what the commotion was, as the clergyman hurriedly picked up his belongings. "Are you all right?" asked Sarah with a look of concern. I'm sorry. Terribly sorry, miss. But this is beyond my abilities," Reverend Thompson stammered, trying to catch his breath. He jumped to his feet and hurried toward the front door. "Is there nothing you can do?" Sarah asked, following him out. "Afraid not. I suggest you all leave now," Reverend Thompson replied, avoiding her eyes as he ran over to his carriage and climbed onto it. The clergyman ushered a command with a snap of the reins, causing the horse to neigh and snort as it sped away into the darkening night. Chapter 8: Confrontation with Lady Agatha. Sarah stood alone, shivering in the attic. It was dark save for the lantern she brought. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest as she prepared to confront the vengeful ghost of Lady Agatha. The failed exorcism had only made things worse, and she knew that something had to be done before it was too late. With a deep breath, she called out into the silence, hoping the ghost would hear her. "Lady Agatha, I know you're here. Please, I beg of you. Tell me what I can do to bring you peace." Silence hung in the air for a moment before the ghostly figure of Lady Agatha materialized before her. Her eyes were cold and filled with malice, and Sarah could feel her skin prickle with fear. "What could you possibly do to make things right?" Lady Agatha sneered, her voice echoing in the room. I don't know," Sarah stammered, her mind racing. "But please, there must be something you seek." Lady Agatha's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained steely. "You're right," she said, her voice growing quieter. "But there is one thing that could bring me some solace. Revenge on the townsfolk." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as Lady Agatha continued. "I want them to suffer as I did. And I want it to start with all the inhabitants of this house." With that, Lady Agatha let out a wicked cackle and disappeared. Terror gripped Sarah as the words sunk in. She knew she had to act fast to protect the children. She hurriedly made her way back to the children's rooms, only to find them missing. Panic set in as she searched every corner of the manor for them. The servants had no idea where they could be, and Sarah's mind raced with fear and guilt. Had she failed in her duties as their governess? Chapter 9, Redemption. Reverend Thompson rode back to town as fast as he could, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. He'd never experienced anything supernatural nor seen a ghost before. What he just witnessed was the most terrifying thing he ever saw in his life. The clergyman would rather forget the experience and never return to the manor, but that thought didn't sit right with him. If anything were to happen to the residents there, he didn't think he could live with himself. The exorcism had been an utter failure. The situation seemed dire, and he knew he needed help. The residents at the manor needed help. Reverend Thompson had to put his pride aside because there was only one man he could turn to now. The Reverend snapped the reins, commanding the horse to go faster as he made his way to Caspar Blake's house. It was a tiny cabin on the edge of town. When he got there, he almost thought the man was elsewhere until he made his way around and saw a subtly flickering light through one of the windows. He banged loudly on the door and called out for Blake, but no one answered. He paced back and forth nervously, wondering if maybe the man had passed out from drinking too much. Reverend Thompson then decided to try the doorknob. To his surprise, it wasn't even locked. He walked in and found the former priest sitting in front of the fireplace with a pistol in his hand. The gun was on the man's lap and not directed at Reverend Thompson, but it still made him nervous. Beside the former priest, on a small table, sat a bottle of alcohol and a candle. There was a tense and awkward silence as the two men stared at one another until Reverend Thompson finally spoke. "Caspar, I mean Mr. Father, Blake." "Just Blake will do," the former priest said in a gravelly voice. I am Reverend Thompson," said the clergyman, his eyes still fixed on the gun. "I know who you are. Now state your business or be gone." Reverend Thompson gulped, then said, I need your help." They need your help. Please. There's been an incident involving a ghost." The Reverend stood there trying to gauge a reaction, but there was none. Blake remained exactly the same as he did when the clergyman arrived. "Go on," Blake said. Reverend Thompson continued, telling him about the failed exorcism and his encounter with Lady Agatha. "Hell! A man can't even die in peace," Blake sighed after hearing the Reverend's story as he looked toward the ceiling like he were addressing God himself. He stood up and holstered his pistol to his waist. The man told Reverend Thompson he had to gather a few things before they head out. The Reverend went to wait for him in the carriage. After a brief moment, Blake came out with a sack in hand and the two of them took off. On the way, the former priest explained the gravity of the situation to Reverend Thompson. "Based on what you've told me, it doesn't look good. Lady Agatha is no ordinary ghost. Her soul may have been completely warped by hate, transforming her into something else." "What? Like an evil spirit or maybe even a demon?" asked Reverend Thompson. Blake nodded, confirming the Reverend's worst fears, and he swallowed the lump forming in his throat. "The only thing we can do now is to get everyone out of the house, as a confrontation with a demon can have fatal consequences," Blake said. He produced 4 silver pendant necklaces with crosses on them and a vial of holy water from his sack and said to Reverend Thompson, "The holy water was blessed by John the Baptist himself. The necklaces were submerged in its content and blessed by a high priest. They are to provide the wearer protection against evil." They traveled a while in silence, but there was something Reverend Thompson had been wanting to ask the former priest but couldn't muster the courage to do so, afraid he may not like the answer. He decided to ask anyway. "What does the demon want?" "Who knows, but it's probably trying to possess someone if not already, and when it does, it can travel outside the constraints of the manor and survive in daylight, Blake replied. All the blood drained from the Reverend's face upon hearing the words. I hope we're not too late. Chapter 10, Massacre. Reverend Thompson and Blake arrived at the manor. It was clear that something sinister had taken hold. It was pitch black with no light from any of the windows. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under their feet as they made their way towards the entrance. The air was heavy with an eerie silence, making the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The two men exchanged a glance before they each put on the silver necklaces. These were their only protection against the evil lurking inside. With lanterns in hand, they pushed open the door and entered the manor. The first level was a scene of carnage. Bodies lay scattered around the room, blood and gore coating the walls and floors. The stench of death hung heavy in the air. Though he was disgusted, Blake didn't show it. He'd seen it many times as a soldier during the wars and afterward when he served as a priest performing exorcisms. Good God! Reverend Thompson gasped. He wanted to pray for their poor souls, but there was no time. They pressed on, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. They made their way up the stairs and came across the children's bedrooms. More bodies lay strewn across the floor, but one woman was still alive. It was Mrs. Jacobs, who was barely conscious. Sarah, she went mad, killed everyone, looking for the children. She barely managed to utter the words. With her final breath, Mrs. Jacobs urged them to save William and Abigail. The sound of movement downstairs spurred them into action, and they hurried down to investigate. The noise led them to the basement and they were hit with an unbearable rotting stench. Soon they came upon a pile of dead bodies in one of the rooms where the source of smell emanated from. Reverend Thompson gagged at the sight, but they continued on, their determination to save the children giving them the strength to keep going. The sound grew louder, leading them to a room at the end of a hall, where Sarah was trying to break into a closet with an axe. Miss Sarah! Please stop this at once! Shouted Reverend Thompson. The woman spun around to face the duo. Even her movements were awkward and stiff. She had a maniacal wide-toothy grin on her face. The pupils of her eyes were gone, so only whites remained. Dark veins spread from her neck to the edge of her face. Her dress and hair was coated in blood. Sarah's no longer here, laughed the possessed woman. I'm surprised you came back, Reverend, because you ran like a coward earlier. Enough. It ends here, demon. We're gonna send you to hell where you should be, Blake said. Bold words, eh, Casper? It didn't go so well last time, did it? Sarah cackled. Blake gritted his teeth at the comment. Powerful demons and evil spirits have the ability to read minds, and they liked using it as a tactic to unsettle their victims or foes. Knowing about it didn't make it feel any better because Blake's last exorcism ended in a disaster with innocent lives being lost. The memories from it still haunted him. It was the sole reason why he drank. Without a moment's hesitation, the woman lunged at them. Blake barely had time to push Reverend Thompson out of the way. One of their lanterns broke, splashing oil and fire onto a wooden support beam, causing it to become ablaze. Sarah was on the former priest at once with an onslaught of wild swinging attacks. The axe hacked off bits of the wall and floor, spraying debris on him. He tried to back away, but he tripped and fell. Sarah, poised to strike the final blow, raised the axe, but before she had a chance to bring it down, Reverend Thompson wrapped her in a bear hug. She was much stronger than he anticipated, and his grip started to loosen as she twisted and turned to shed him off her, but the Reverend was stubborn and held on for his dear life. The woman sent him flying into the wall by running backwards into it. Reverend Thompson's head bounced off the wall with a thump and his body went slack. The Reverend's efforts weren't wasted, however, and bought Blake just enough time to splash the vial of holy water onto Sarah's face. The liquid sizzled on contact, causing her to drop the axe and writhe in agony. The man wrestled her to the ground, struggling to put his necklace around her neck. While all that was happening, the flames cracked and popped as it had spread onto the ceiling of the basement, bathing the whole scene in an orange glow. A haze of smoke had begun building up around them, burning their eyes and suffocating them. The children! Get the children! Blake coughed. Disoriented, Reverend Thompson struggled to regain his footing. Nevertheless, he still managed to retrieve the bag with the rest of the necklaces and coax the terrified children out of the closet. The Reverend placed a necklace around each of their necks. Sarah screamed and growled as the priest finally managed to secure the necklace around her neck. Reverend Thompson slung William over his shoulder while Sarah had Abigail in her arms. They made their way out of the basement, but realized Blake wasn't following them. "Aren't you coming?" Reverend Thompson asked. Blake shook his head. "There's something I need to take care of." "I can help you," insisted the Reverend. "You can't help me." "No one can," growled Blake, doubling over and straining. "He's not well. We have to go," Sarah called out, heading for the stairs. Reverend Thompson protested until Blake pulled out his pistol and aimed it at him. His gunarm trembled violently and sweat beaded from his brow as he resisted Lady Agatha's control. The Reverend finally understood what was going on when he saw dark veins creeping from Casper Blake's neck to the side of his face. "Go now. Can't hold out much longer," Blake said, gritting his teeth. The Reverend had only just met the man and didn't know his past, but he couldn't help but have compassion for him. He didn't know how Blake was able to resist the possession the way he did, but he had to admire the man's willpower. Reverend Thompson didn't think he had it within himself to hold on for as long as he did. Perhaps it was better for it to be him than I, the Reverend thought. "You're a greater man than any I've ever known." "God be with you," the Reverend said, and he hurried after Sarah. The Reverend was halfway to the stairs when he heard a loud pop followed by a thud from behind him. It startled him for a split second, but he continued on, his heart heavy with sorrow. Sarah and Reverend Thompson made it to the carriage with the children in tow and drove away. William and Abigail looked on one last time as their home crumbled and burned behind them, relieved they would never have to return to that place of horror again. Chapter 11, Reflection. Word was sent out to Mr. and Mrs. Wentworth about the incident while Sarah and the children stayed at the church awaiting their return. During Sarah's stay there, she and Reverend Thompson reflect on their experiences of that fateful night. "We've talked at length about what happened, and I want to make it clear that it wasn't your fault, but what else can you tell me? And as we've discussed before, that I am documenting this for future references. So my question is, what was it like, being in a state of possession? Do you recall anything at all?" asked Reverend Thompson. "Yes, I understand, and I'll try to answer your questions as best I can, but all of it is still very overwhelming. So, while I was under its..." Sarah paused to clear her throat and compose herself, then continued. "While I was under her control, it felt like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I was stuck in a sort of loop filled with painful visions, memories, and emotions. It was as if I lived them myself. I'm not saying she was right or that what happened was justified in any way, but I could understand why she was so angry." "Exactly what visions did you see?" the Reverend asked. Sarah sighed. "Where do I even begin?" That's it for this episode. We apologize for not having chapters available for this story yet, but we'll be adding it shortly. Again, if you enjoy the story, please like, comment, subscribe and share. You can also purchase merchandise from the Pocket Shop in the description. Thanks everyone.